So here we are with Lost Battles by Fifth Column Games, and I'm setting up and playing through Marathon from 490 BC, an Athenian army on the left facing off against a Persian army on the right. The Athenian army will go first. Before I get stuck into this, I'm going to just give an outline of some of the rules ideas. This is not meant to be a complete rules summary, but it is meant to be a quick look at some of the principles and ideas, and that will mean that when we come to the playthrough I don't have to explain absolutely everything from the start, and then I can just look at some of the exceptions and some of the decisions being made, and it hopefully will make some sense because there's a grounding of what is happening. So the game is played on these 20 tiles on the 5x4 board with these sets of units. The way the armies are differentiated is that one army has units with black writing on a white background, and some have white writing on a black background. So that tells you which army is which, and the rules tell you which set of counters to use for each side and which side goes first, and gives you a historical setup. That historical setup is assumed to have taken the first turn. So what's actually happened is that we started on turn 0, and then these units all got brought on from a nominal off-board holding area over here, and this was where they ended up after that first turn's activations and movement, and now you play from here, having deployed automatically according to the setup instructions. So we've had one turn, and this is where we've ended up, and that's pretty cool. And it also means that you can free deploy, so you can actually start from turn 0 with everything in your off-board holding area and deploy as you wish if you prefer, but it's recommended that you play some battles with the historical deployments before you start messing around like that. So in a tile you're going to have some of your units. You can never have units from both sides in a tile. It's held by one or the other, and they all have to face the same direction, and directions in this are the 4 edges of the tile. We don't use any diagonals for anything, so it's all orthogonal. Units have to all face the same way, and there's a stacking limit of 12 units in a tile where levies count 2. So, for example, over here we have a tile with 8 units in it, but 3 are levies, so they count for 6. These are 5, so they're within their stacking limit because there's an 11 stacking in there against a limit of 12. So they can move forward into there because these are average archers, not levy archers. But were they levy, that group would not be able to all move in there because that would take them over their stacking limit. Stacking limit of 12. So there's an interplay in the game between commands, which you are given each turn based on the fighting value of your army, and it's basically 10% of the fighting value of your army rounded down. So the Athenians start with 63, the Persians with 59. So in their first turn, the Athenians will get 6 orders, and the Persians will get 5. And there's an interplay between commands and activations and actions. So you use commands to pick activations, and then those activations give your units actions. So there are 3 types of activation. There's normal, limited, and express. I could run through them fairly quickly. A normal activation costs either 1 command for a single unit or 2 commands for the whole group, and it gives 1 action for infantry, 2 for non-cataphractic cavalry or chariots, but let's just stick with infantry for now. It'll give them 1 action, and an action is basically moving forward, moving straight ahead, changing facing 90 degrees, or fighting what's in front of you. So those are your 3 options. So for a for 2 commands to do a normal activation, we could then activate this whole group and we could swing them through 90 degrees and have them all facing that way, ready to move towards the enemy down over here. If you want to move into a zone which already has your own units, you have to be able to match their facing. So we've got another average hoplite facing that way. We couldn't currently move in here with a normal activation. We couldn't activate these for 2 commands, normal activation, because that would give us 1 action, and 1 action would only get us to here, and we're facing the wrong way. We couldn't do that. In order to get into there, we'd have to perform what's called an express activation, and that gives us 2 actions. An express activation gives us 2 actions, but they can't be fighting. You can move and change facing, but you can't fight with an express activation. But that would give us the required actions to go 1 and then match the facing of that unit in here, and then we'd be legal again. The problem with that is that express activations cost 2 per unit, so they cost 2 commands per unit, so it would cost us 8 commands to get these 4 average hoplite infantry in here facing the right way in a legal fashion. So you can see that it's not always straightforward to move units around, certainly not split them up and combine them in different ways. You can charge them forward, or you can move them forward in what you assume are lines fairly easily, but the moment you want to do more complex operations with them, more complex maneuvers, it gets much more costly very quickly, which is pretty cool. You can see, even though it's abstract, it's got a lot of quite a lot of nuance to it. The other activation type is called a limited activation, and that costs 1 command for any size of group, and that gives you 1 action, or 2 if you're non-cataphractic cavalry or chariots, but you can't use those actions to move. You can change facing and fight. So we could change facing over here for 1 command if that's what we wanted to do, instead of paying the 2 that it would cost us for the normal activation. So there are ways to do things more cheaply and more easily in this game, depending on your situation and what you're trying to get done. It's important to note that back on the command track, the turn sequence is that one side is going to get their commands. They're going to spend them until they're down to 1 or 0, so they're going to spend 1 or 2 commands doing something, 2 commands doing something. When they hit 1 or 0 commands, they're going to roll a d6 and add that many commands to their total, so they'll get 2 more and they'll go up to 3, and then at that point, once they've spent or used all the commands that they want to, then they're finished for the turn, and we go to the other side and they get their 5 or whatever commands based on their fighting value. Once they get down to 1 or 0, they'll roll their dice, get an extra command, and then they're finished, and that's the end of their turn, and we move forward. So fighting is just a function of expending commands. It's not done in a particular there's no set sort of turn order where you move and fight and this and that and the other. You just expend commands, and when you want to fight, or when you're in a situation where you're ready to fight and want to, you attack what's in front of you by performing the necessary activation, spending the commands, and getting on with it. Fighting is essentially done between neighbouring tiles, and what you have in any given fight is a lead unit for both sides and a bunch of following units. So if we just face off some units against each other in sort of neighbouring tiles, let's just put three of these levy archers in here. What you'd have is a lead unit on each side, and that is going to supply the hit numbers for this lead unit and the following units. When anything, this matrix is going to tell you what you need to throw on 2d6 to score a hit on that lead unit, or 2 hits on that lead unit if you get a particularly great roll. And you're going to get a bunch of modifiers based on whether you're lead units and whether you're hoplites and whether you're fresh and whether they're levies and all kinds of things. And as it turns out, these fresh hoplites would be significantly better than these levy archers, even though they're both classed as heavy infantry in this game, so are basically on a 9 versus 9 on the combat chart. But the modifiers would give the hoplites a significant advantage against those levies. One of the, I'll explain hits first. Whenever you're hit, you flip over and you become spent, and that's signified by the red flash on the back of the unit. And if you're hit again, then you're shattered and you're removed from the board and added to your side's shattered pile. And when a unit becomes shattered, your army has to take a morale check, which is very bad. It starts off not too bad, but it quickly becomes very bad. And again, that morale check is modified, is rolled for the entire army, so you end up with an army morale value, and then you go around each unit and you just check that with the modifiers it doesn't take that unit's morale to 0 or -1. If it does, bad things start to happen, depending on specific circumstances, which we'll get into during the gameplay. So essentially what would happen here is that our lead unit would attack this Levy Archer lead unit by rolling his 2d6 and applying his modifiers. So let's just do a quick roll, and he's got a 5, and with his modifiers that probably wouldn't be enough and not do anything. And then our following units would attack, and we'd get another roll, and that 9 with modifiers might be enough, and so he would take a hit. At the point where you take a hit as a defender, you're allowed to swap out your lead unit for another lead unit, so we could then just swap in a new lead unit, and our next unit would attack and get an 8, and maybe he's got a +2, and that would hit, and again we'd swap that out, and we'd put our last fresh unit in the front there, and maybe our last hoplite attacks, and we give it a roll and he gets a 10, and that would be interesting. We'll get to this in the gameplay, but one of the key weaknesses of levies is that if they take 2 hits on a single roll, they have to take them both and shatter. If the levy got a brilliant roll and managed to put 2 hits into the hoplite could still absorb the first hit, swap for another hoplite, absorb the second hit, and then put a fresh hoplite in front. So they can absorb 2 hits as a group, but levies cannot. If levies get 2 hits in a single attack, they are shattered, and that prompts the morale checks that we fear, because other spent units would be at significant disadvantage for passing that, and so on. So the key idea, or the key weakness of this Persian Levy Archer army, is their inability to soak these multiple hits, so they at any time they're at risk of being shattered, and that's a pretty key weakness in the playthroughs I've had so far. Anyway, that would then end this combat, assuming that nothing was shattered and we'd have to make morale rolls. Let's say that the roll was just enough to cause a hit. You'd now have 3 spent Levy Archers in here, but they would then be capable of attacking back and seeing what they could do in response. So that's a very quick rundown of combat. And that's pretty much it. You have to be conscious of the modifiers and how the morale rules work, but we'll get into that when we need to. And yes, you just keep spending orders and moving the turn marker forward. As you lose units, your fighting value drops and you lose commands, and you end up in more and more of a state until one side wins. There is a fairly complex sort of scoring mechanism at the end of the game, and it has a kind of handicap system which kind of levels up the sides based on the differential of the fighting values of the armies at the start. These two are ostensibly quite well matched, 63 against 59. It doesn't tend to work out like that, but not that I've seen, just because the weaknesses of these levies, against these hoplites, the couple of cavalry units that they've got on the flanks don't seem enough to compensate for the weaknesses of the levies relative to the hoplites, and they seem to get rolled over. But I'm going to try something just slightly different to see if we can at least match the Greek Athenian army. One last thing to mention, I guess, would be leaders. Leaders come in two flavours. There are, sorry, I should call them generals, and generals come in two flavours. There are leaders and commanders. The difference between those is that leaders are attached to specific units, and commanders are not. They float around in zones and move about quite freely. That makes commanders more flexible, but they don't fight with units. But essentially they both do the same thing, and that is they soak up the command cost of issuing commands in a particular zone up to the limit that they're allowed to based on how good they are. That was a very wordy way of, but basically they come in a number of ratings. So these are uninspiring, and then you can have average, and you can have inspiring, and you can have brilliant. And an uninspiring leader will reduce the command, the command cost of an activation in their zone by 1. So if you've got all these guys in here, and you wanted to move them forward, normally you would be issuing using a normal activation to which would cost you 2 commands, and then you moving them forward. But this guy reduces that cost by 1. He pays 1 of that cost on your behalf, and you only pay 1 command to move them forward. Similarly, if you wanted to fight with them, it would cost you 1 command instead of the normal 2. And one last thing, you can spend commands. You spend commands usually at the rate of 2 commands for a +1 to give yourself that +1 in a combat. And separate from the activation cost reduction, they will also pay towards that cost as well. So an uninspiring general will pay 1 towards that cost as well. So if you wanted to put 2 commands into a +1 for a unit in here, the first time you did that, it would cost you 1 command instead of the normal 2. An average commander will give you a 2 activation cost reduction and a 2 combat cost reduction. I think inspiring is 3, and brilliant is 4. Yes. So a brilliant commander is giving you 4 free command points to spend on activations in your zone, and 4 bonus command points to bump your units in combat, which is pretty hefty. And that's it. That is a very rough and ready summary of the basic ideas in the game. There will be more nuance and more subtlety that comes out in this playthrough and playthroughs that involve a wider range of units. But for now, I think that's sufficient to get stuck into the gameplay here at Marathon.